Hi everyone, I'm Jenny McGowan. I'm the Director of Asia for Keystone Tutors, and I've got here Ed Richardson, who's the Director of Education, who knows an awful lot about school entrance exams, has spent many years helping students prepare and giving advice on it. So we're going to talk about the different types of entrance exams and kind of pick Ed's brain about what they involve and how you can help your children prepare. So Ed, to start with, I appreciate that lots of schools do different things, and therefore there is a whole kind of load of different types of tests. But could you give a brief overview to start with at kind of 11 or 13 plus, what school entrance assessments normally consist of?
Yes, I'd say for most students who are applying internationally, I would say the vast majority of schools will set some form of assessment at 11 and 13 plus that will be probably computerized. But broadly speaking, we split assessments into two groups, computerized and those that are paper-based. Invariably, they cover the same sorts of topics, English, maths and reasoning. And the computerized screening has definitely been something that's exploded in terms of the number of schools using it over the last couple of years. The most prominent of which are the UK ISET and the ICB pre-test, although quite a few schools will have developed their own tests, like the Harrow test, the Eton test. These are tests that are developed by the school. Typically, these tests appear secondary to an initial test. So essentially an entrance procedure, either 11 or 13 plus, might have two stages. The first of which might be a more general test, such as the ICB Common Pre-test or the UK ISET. And then the second stage might be more of a school-specific test. But I wouldn't forget paper-based tests, because there are some schools who still require international students to sit paper-based tests, whether that be in the UK or alternatively in different parts of the world, like Hong Kong.
Okay, and in terms of their obviously academic tests, are there ever anything else involved, say like an assessment day or an interview or something?
Yep, very much so. Normally the assessment is just the first part of the process. The second part of the process typically is an interview. These can be run on the same day, or equally these can be run sort of subsequently. It depends on the school. As an example, the Eton, they will run an assessment day where students will have to come to the school. Obviously, we don't know quite how that'll work in COVID times, but normally you would come to the school, you would sit an assessment, then you have an interview, almost an hour or so after you'd completed your test. So there are assessment days, and there are even overnight stays. So some schools will ask you to come as a part of a kind of an immersive experience where you would be there for maybe 24 hours, 48 hours, and in that time they would ask you for some form of assessment. But I would say the principal addition to some form of academic test would be an interview. There's been the proliferation of online Skype interviews now occurring, obviously, over the last couple of months. And so I would imagine schools will continue to use those as well. So interviews are very important, but assessment days do take place as well.
Great, thanks for that. So it would be good now to talk about how students can specifically prepare for these different components. So based on kind of all your years of experience and what our tutors can do. So in terms of a timeline to start with, when would you suggest parents start to think about preparation more broadly, and what might this look like before they know what schools they're applying for and they know what specific tests the students will need to take?
Well, I would say that most of your parents probably are going to be looking at boarding schools, applying from, and parents for better are going to be applying for boarding schools, I'm assuming. So I'm going to sort of speak to that category of parent more generally. So I would imagine if they are looking to do that, they're going to either join the school at the earliest at 11, if they're joining perhaps an all-girls school like Cheltenham Ladies College or Benetton, so i.e. a year 7 entry, which would be 11 plus, or they're going to join year 9, which would be a 13 plus entry. I would say in both cases, I would say you want to be thinking about sort of your game plan and your strategy when your child is in year 4. So that is when your child is turning 9. And I think that's an important time. That would give you enough time to think about what kinds of schools you could consider. You could even visit them either virtually or physically. And equally, that would also give you enough time to start thinking about the necessary preparation. So I would definitely start considering at around about that age. Because I think that's an important window that gives you ample time, and also both in terms of visiting schools and assessing which school options might work best for you, but then also preparing for the necessary assessments. And indeed, I would say most schools, their deadline for entry, some appear around the year 5 mark. So that would give you a sort of a good amount of time in preparation to meet any sort of deadline.
Okay, great. And so then in terms of that year or two before any types of tests, at a broader level, what type of preparation would you suggest that students start to do?
Well, the first thing I would say is I would definitely not worry about these assessments in terms of how specific they are. I think one of the things that I think I encounter, and I'm sure you encounter a lot, is that parents telling me about school-specific nature of assessments. I mean, yes, schools do have particular assessments, and yes, they can differ. But broadly speaking, these assessments are assessing children in English, maths, and reasoning invariably, and they're assessing them at sort of the Key Stage 2 level of the English national curriculum. And I think what's important then, therefore, is to try and understand where your child is in relation to the British National Curriculum. And the way that I would do that is to perform some form of diagnostic assessment. Crudely speaking, you could go onto the school's website if they share past papers and download one, and then simply kind of have a go at it and see how your child fares. Equally, you could come to places like ours, and we would assess you in English, maths, and reasoning, and then give you an indication of where the areas of strength are, and then also where the areas for development are, which then enable you to kind of ensure that your child is preparing accordingly. It will also give you a good indication of what schools are appropriate, because you may have thought, well, ideally we're thinking about this type of school, but the diagnostic assessment may suggest that this is perhaps well within your reach, or it may be well outside of your reach, and as a consequence, therefore, you might want to adjust your thinking with regards to schools. So I would start with a diagnostic assessment of some sort. I would also appreciate the fact that the assessments, broadly speaking, are going to be based on the core UK curriculum, English and maths. And as a consequence, the key then is to try and work out where your child is in relation to those levels.
Great. And so that would be the kind of general preparation, is just keeping up with the UK curriculum. So then once you know which schools specifically that you are applying for, let's think about kind of top tips for the specific tests you might take. So if we focus on computerized tests to start with, which, as you said, is often the initial screening stage, what would you kind of suggest there in terms of preparation?
So the people that make these tests suggest that you can't prepare for them. And I say suggest because I do think that's slightly ambiguous, and I'm not sure that it's entirely correct. And the reason I would say this is because fundamentally, I think that if you had two students, one of whom was familiar with what the types of questions were and the type of test they were about to encounter, and one that wasn't, I do feel the one that was familiar is likely to do slightly better. So I think familiarization is really important. So to give your child a sense of what is coming, and that might just simply be an exposure to multiple choice testing, because that typically is a key feature with online tests. And it's something that you don't normally do within schools, or at least in the UK anyway. Online multiple choice testing is not commonplace or de rigueur within English and math sessions. So as a consequence, I think for a lot of students to see the answers there and then have to select the correct one from, let's say, 4 options, that is quite different to what they're normally asked to do within the context of their English and maths lessons at school, where it's normally a free text box where they've got to kind of write out their answer, or they've got to kind of add up in order to create their kind of maths solution. So I think I would definitely stress familiarization, and I think the way in which you do that is by exposing them to the different sort of software that's online, whether that be both for 11 plus, Atom Learning, Keystone tests. There are many, and I don't think there's necessarily one silver bullet. I think it's about trying to give them exposure to a great many of these so that they kind of feel supple and flexible. Because after all, these tests are really about speed and accuracy. That's what they're assessing. And I think students that can develop a sort of a certain sense of familiarization about the kind of speed required, but also kind of appreciate the kinds of skills you might need to tackle a multiple choice question, I think will fare better. And I also just think on a practical sort of psychological, emotional level, I think they'll feel a lot more comfortable in that exam setting. Don't forget, I guess, there's huge amounts of anxiety. And if they, not that they should predict or know exactly what's coming, but more that they kind of are roughly aware of the sorts of things they might be required to do, I do think that will help to settle them more quickly and will likely give them the opportunity to perform, representative of themselves, to give a performance that would be fair and associated with their kind of true ability.
Great. That's really useful. So assuming that they take the computerized test, maybe that's screening, they've kind of got through to that. Then the next stage, as you mentioned, is often potentially a written paper. And for students, in my experience in international schools, often those written papers are actually the kind of more alien component. They often are quite different to maybe what they're doing at international school or at local school.
Sure.
So if a student is going to have to take written papers at some point, what would your kind of suggestions for that be?
So I think one of the things not to confuse with regards to parents is that just preparing for online tests doesn't mean you only do online, you only interact with online software. In fact, I would say that's not the solution. I think probably what you need to do is to yes, make sure that you are engaging with online testing software, but I think what you also need to do is to ensure that your solid English or your core English and maths fundamentals are really, really strong. And I think the way in which you develop those is obviously going to be paper-based, typically, or online if you're having tutoring and you're based in another country. So I would say that those written papers, the skills that are incorporated in them are also shared across online forms of assessment as well. But as you rightly point out, the way they're formatted and structured is just very different, and even very different from the kinds of exams that students might expect to face within their own countries. So I think familiarization again to these types of assessments is crucial, but I also think that just working on the kind of fundamentals of English and maths at Key Stage 2 is going to be very, very important as well, because what's important is that their fundamentals are strong, because as and when they're asked to kind of think more broadly, or they're challenged in a kind of a more problem-solving manner, they'll have those fundamentals to rely upon to utilize those skills to be able to tackle the slightly more challenging questions. And written papers often will kind of increase in difficulty. So you'll find towards the end of the paper, the question type and difficulty will tend to increase. And so I think making sure that they're capable of kind of tackling those types of questions is going to be really important. But practice is going to be key, but as much as making sure their fundamentals in English and maths are really tip top.
Yeah, and by having the fundamentals strong, in theory, then any exam they're faced, whatever the format might be,
whatever the format,
they're going to do well in, especially given that often the written papers can be quite quickly after the computerized, so you can't suddenly cram in all that preparation.
No. I don't think they should be seen as two distinct forms of preparation. I really do think that the core is going to be sort of written based or online tutoring on the fundamentals of English and maths and reasoning, and then I think the sprinkling on top, which perhaps is done maybe outside of the tutoring session, where you would do little and often practice on online software. And of course, if you had then particular difficulties with non-verbal reasoning type of question, or a verbal reasoning type of question, or even an English or a maths type of question, you'd bring that to your tutorial or your parents, and you perhaps break that down to look at how you might tackle that. But I think fundamentally you've got to focus on English, maths and reasoning at the core level, which will set you up very well for both paper-based and computerized tests.
Great. So then for interviews, which you mentioned previously, I suppose, what are they looking for in an interview, and how would you suggest that parents work with their children to prepare for those?
So I think interviews are looking to extrapolate from a student to work out the kind of the person behind the application. They will have received a reference from the school, which invariably probably pretty good. They may have seen some assessment data, which probably, if they're asking you to interview, will also be pretty good. And so what they're trying to work out is the personality and the character of the individual, and trying to work out whether that would be well suited to the environment which the child is applying to, i.e. the school they're applying to. And each school is different. They're nuanced, as you know, and they do have slightly different environments, and they will suit different students for different reasons. It may be that year 9, for example, has collective boarding, so everyone's together rather than in separate houses. It may be that actually they've got their own rooms, and that would suit different people for different reasons. It may be that a school has a particular bent or orientation towards an extracurricular activity or perhaps academia. So they all have differences, and as a consequence, different types of students will suit different schools. And I think that's a really important consideration for parents to make. So the interview, or the interviewer, is trying to work out, does the interest of this child align with what we're doing here, and can we add value to them? Are they going to enjoy their experience here? And if we take hold of them for 7 or 5 years, are we going to look after them? And can we develop them? And can we do something with them that their parents are going to be proud of? So I think that's the key thing, is that they want to learn and to understand about you. And so I think that's an important point. The other point is to say that if they've invited you to interview, they're interested. I think a lot of students go into interviews nervous, which is fair enough. But I think I wouldn't let nerves get the better of you. They have asked to meet you, and that's because they're genuinely interested in you. And for the 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever the length of time is, they are there and ready and willing to listen. So it's your opportunity to put your best foot forward. I think with regards to kind of preparation, I think just thinking about the sorts of things that might be asked. So, I mean, generally, they'll ask about your family, your school, your academic interests, your extracurricular interests, reading, which is a really big point. Typically, the schools will discuss. They might ask you some moral or logic or lateral thinking questions, and they might also ask you, why is it you want to come to this school? So there's I think most parents could probably cobble that kind of list of topics together in terms of what they're likely to ask. And I guess it's then about just ensuring that a student is confident enough to have a conversation about those things, and to ensure they give enough detail and depth. And the only thing I would probably say is that a lot of children fall into the trap of listing achievements. That doesn't score you any points necessarily. It's actually about your articulacy, your ability to kind of give an informed response to a question. And I think that means a structured, a well thought through answer, and that you've genuinely listened to what the question is asking you, and then you've thought about a detailed response. So it's not about cramming all the information that's possibly occurred in your life over the last 11 or 13 years. It's actually just trying to be selective in response to the question that's being asked. PEE is a great tactic. So point, evidence, explanation. So do you enjoy reading? Your point might be yes. Your evidence might be I read every day, and then your explanation might be, well, I'm currently reading, the trilogy by Philip Pullman, The Northern Lights, and I'm absolutely loving The Amber Sky Glass for these reasons. And then you talk about that. So that kind of gives a good structure, or just generally a because is quite good. So you should never give a one-word answer. You should probably, unless it's a maths question, of course, you should explain why. So, football is my favorite sport, because you should be explaining why that's the case rather than just giving a simple statement. So I think practice is very good. And I think parents can just be encouraging children to have deeper conversations with them. So rather than just simply using closed questions where the response is yes or no, trying to give open questions where they've got to give genuine responses, and responses that have detail, and pick them up on that if they're not clear. I think encourage them to talk about their reading, perhaps films you might be watching over the weekend, experiences you might have seen, museums, galleries. Obviously, we hope all of these things will occur in the future, but experiences you're having as a family, try to get them to talk, as confidently as possible. And of course, meeting people like yourself and having mock interviews, that's also going to be a very important part of the process.
Yeah, I think being genuine is a big one. I always think you can tell very quickly if a child is regurgitating something their parents have told them to say.
Absolutely. I think that's a big no-no.
It's easy to see through that.
Yeah.
Great. So for kind of 11 and 13 plus, that's covered kind of most of the different entrance assessments really, really well. So the final thing I wanted to ask you about was 16 plus. So if students are applying to go to the UK for the final 2 years of school, because the process can be a little bit different. So could you give a little bit of information about kind of the differences there?
So 16 plus is quite different, and I guess schools can be grouped in roughly two camps. Typically, 16 plus assessment and admissions will either assess you in the A levels or IB subjects you want to do at higher level, or they'll assess you in English, maths, and sort of reasoning more generally. Or they might do a sort of a hybrid where they'll assess your English despite the fact you want to do maths, further maths, physics and chemistry at A level. They might still assess your English because they want to know that you can access, the curriculum and the teaching within a UK school. But broadly speaking, I would say they're in those sort of two camps. So you either have subject specific tests in relation to the things you want to do in the sixth form, or a more kind of general sort of English assessment, or it can be, as I said, a hybrid of the two. So I think, again, what is really useful about 16 plus preparation is that invariably students are working towards their IGCSEs or qualifications when they're 16, and actually preparing for those and making sure that you're really tip top in English, maths, and the subjects you'd like to do at sixth form can be beneficial for two reasons. One is obviously helpful in the 16 plus preparation for those examinations, but equally helpful to when you actually sit those assessments at school or as a part of your kind of wider assessment program that you'll be completing. So I think it is a bit different, but in the sense that other subjects can come in, i.e. the subjects you'd like to study at sixth form. But broadly speaking, there's going to be a series of assessments. It's worth also noting that the UK ISET is also done typically for a lot of international schools. Sorry, a lot of UK schools will set that for international students at 16 plus.
Great. And if a student was, say, in a local school somewhere in Asia, or maybe they were in an international school that was maybe American, or they weren't following the UK curriculum and therefore doing GCSEs, would you say that then the 16 plus exams are kind of out of reach, or how would they kind of bridge that gap?
So I think they'd follow the same sort of process that we discussed earlier for the 11 and 13 plus. I think a diagnostic assessment would be the best way to go to try and work out what it is, where their level is in relation to their UK peers. It may be that a kind of a brief conversation with someone like yourself would be sensible before to try and work out, well, what subjects would you study at sixth form, because that might not be something that's really sort of set within their head yet. And also maybe a discussion between IB versus A level. There's a sense that international students, because of the kinds of curriculum they've been accessing, might be better suited to IB, but that's not always the case. So I think perhaps a conversation more broadly with an expert, an advisor, perhaps like yourself, then I think perhaps a diagnostic assessment in the subjects they wish to do, particularly English as well, because that's going to be a key feature. And then from there, I think you get a sense of, well, what schools might be accessible, firstly, but then also what areas for development might need to be worked on between now and the time that you might sit some assessment.
Yeah, that's useful. And I think that it helps with the transition as well. So if you've prepared for these 16 plus exams, ultimately that's also going to help you when you arrive at the school. It will be less of a shock if you've done some of that preparation beforehand.
No, I agree.
Great. So I suppose the final point is just if there's any other kind of top tips or anything else that you wanted to kind of add about the process, really.
Only really reading. I didn't mention reading earlier on. I probably should have done. I think that if you're approaching this from quite a long way off and you've got quite young children, I would definitely recommend reading. Reading with them is really important. I think there's no substitute for it, and trying to encourage them to read as much as possible. And reading can take any form. It doesn't have to be kind of learned tomes of Victorian literature. It could be anything. It could be newspaper articles of your favourite football team. It doesn't really matter. I think as long as children are reading regularly, I think it's a really important thing. Helps to build vocabulary. It helps with their comprehension skills. It's just a really, really key part. I think as parents, you can read with them. You can read to them. You can get them to read to you. You could be reading the same book and just at different speeds, and then having discussions about it. But I think reading is a really key feature. If you're looking at this from quite a long way out, you're thinking about what can I best help my child with. I would say encouraging a love of reading and demonstrating, modelling that, I think is a really good thing. And the other point I would say is that these schools have really good websites in the vast majority of cases, and they have an awful lot of information on them. And so I would really recommend that you look them up and you see what they're offering you, what kind of assessment admissions process there is, what are the timelines, so that you can ensure that you're kind of appropriately prepared and within time to ensure that you kind of meet all of the requirements.
Great, thanks for that. That was really useful, and I think we've covered everything in terms of school entrance assessments. Thank you for that.